Okay, guys, we're going to be looking at Chapter 7, and you can see it is about growth and division, which seem like two opposite words, but that's what we're going to be discussing. When looking at the first slide, Chapter 7, Section 1, we're going to review a little bit about what happened from the Constitution to the Era of Good Feelings. Well, in between there was the War of 1812. It is referred to as the Second War for Independence by some U.S. historians. Maybe you'll grow up and be one of those one day. And was a 32-month military conflict between the United States on one side and the other, Great Britain, its colonies, and its Indian allies in North America. The outcome resolved many issues which remained from the American War for Independence, but involved no boundary changes. The United States declared war in 1812 for several reasons, including trade restrictions brought about by Britain's continuing war with France, the imprisonment of American merchant sailors into the Royal Navy, and British support of American Indian tribes against American expansion. Outrage over insults to national honor after humiliations on the high sea, and possible American interest in annexing Canada. So, you can see to the left there are some important images in the War of 1812. One, of course, is the burning of the White House. Dolly Madison was the first lady at the time, and she is known for not just her cupcakes, but also for saving one of the most famous pictures of George Washington. And, of course, if you look down in the bottom right, the battle that is fought in Baltimore Harbor. And the Star-Spangled Banner is a poem with 4 stanzas, of which we use one, which comes out of that particular battle during the War of 1812. And you can go ahead and go to that place in Baltimore and visit that. And right now in the Smithsonian is the flag that was flying over that area. So, American nationalism. We have the era of good feelings. In this era, Americans were more loyal to the U.S. rather than to a particular state or region, which they're going to pull out of. That's why it's growth and division. There was harmony in in politics. Republicans realized that a stronger federal government was advantageous. And then economic nationalism. What did it do? It created a new national bank protecting American manufacturers from foreign competition and building canals and roads to improve transportation and link the country together. The second bank, the War of 1812 was very expensive. The government had to pay the highest rates on loans. In a response to this, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina proposed a bill to pass the Second Bank of the U.S. in 1816. This gave the bank the ability to issue notes that would serve as currency, and the second U.S. bank could control the state banks. Okay, now let's go on to the next slide. And you guys can see we are still in Section 1. Look at the picture to the right as I read. Tariffs and transportation. In the eyes of the Republican Party, protecting manufacturers, people that make things, was a big deal. In order to make an effort to do this, the tariff of 1816 was levied. That means passed. This tariff was a protective tariff that was designed to nurture American manufacturers by taxing imports to drive up their prices. So if the imports prices were more expensive, then the prices for the people manufacturing in the United States would be cheaper. Some people feel that this is what we should do on China, so that instead of having China's goods be so cheap right now, we would actually have cheaper things that were made by Americans rather than made from China. The government also wanted to improve the nation's transportation system. Originally, the idea was vetoed by President Madison. However, soon after that, road and canal construction began. The judicial nationalism. So, why is it important? Well, Chief John C. Marshall, you can see his picture there, ruled on 3 important cases that established the dominance of the nation over the states and shaped the future of American government as far as the judicial branch goes. So you can see these 3 cases there that were important: Martin versus Hunter's lessee, McCulloch versus Maryland, and Givens versus Ogden. So the first one, in this famous court case, Denny Martin tried to sell land to Virginia inherited from his uncle, Lord Fairfax, a loyalist during the war. Virginia law said no enemy could inherit land. The Supreme Court ruled that Virginia's law conflicted with the 1783 Treaty of Paris. This helped, and this is the decision, establish the Supreme Court as the nation's final court of appeal. McCulloch versus Maryland. In the famous court case, the state of Maryland tried to tax the Second National Bank. However, with the bank being part of the national government, John Marshall ruled that the state government could not interfere with an agency of the federal government exercising its specific constitutional powers within the state's borders. The proposed taxing of the bank was labeled unconstitutional. So if you see in italics, that's the decision that was made. Gibbons versus Ogden. In this famous court case, the state granted a monopoly over steamboat traffic in New York waters. The company then tried to expand to New Jersey through the Hudson River. The Supreme Court ruled that the monopoly was unconstitutional. In all three cases listed here, Marshall's nationalism strengthened the power of the federal government and the expense of the state at the expense of the states. These tough decisions expanded federal power. And if you look at this particular slide, you can see those three cases, and also we see Fletcher versus Peck and Cohen's versus Virginia. And on this slide, we are now under nationalistic diplomacy. Why is it important? Well, the wave of nationalism within Congress and among voters influenced the nation's foreign affairs as well. Until President Monroe, the United States expanded its borders and asserted itself on a world stage. So Andrew Jackson invades Florida. If you look to the right, you can see the area of Florida and what we're talking about, and you can see how these border disputes were happening in those particular areas right there. So, southern states wanted to remove Spain from the area. Slaves were escaping to Florida. After being warned by the Seminoles, they originally were called the Creek people, but the term Seminole meant separate or to separate. To stay out of Florida, Andrew Jackson invaded. He's kind of a wild guy. You know, he is a little crazy and loves war. He removed the Spanish governor and destroyed Seminole villages. John Quincy Adams forced Spain to decide that Florida was causing them too many problems and they weren't controlling the area well. Spain gave Florida to the U.S. and in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, eventually becoming the 27th state. Okay. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is very important because if you look at the Western Hemisphere picture there to the left, that's the area of land that this actually covers. So that's quite a bit of area, and not a lot of it is actually the United States. So it's kind of funny that we would say this, but realistically, could we completely support our stance on this? We really couldn't because, I mean, we're not getting people all the way down to Chile to fight off any people that would want to colonize. But what it was the states, it states that the American continents were henceforth not to be considered subjects for future colonization by the European powers. This was an extremely bold act because the U.S. may not have been able to back it up in its new policy if challenged. Think about this. Just a few years before, European nations enjoyed the ability of conquering many native nations in North and South America. Let's see. Now the U.S. was saying this practice was forbidden. The doctrine was used during 1964 when Russia placed missiles in Cuba. And of course, it wasn't Russia, it was the USSR. If European countries were to try to colonize or invade any part of the Western Hemisphere, it would be considered an act of aggression. And the next section. So as you can see, we are in section 2, early industry. Okay, a revolution in transportation, roads and turnpikes. Why is it important? If a country is well connected to its part, it has better economic control and defense. As early as 1806, the U.S. started a transportation revolution when the National Road was built. Soon after, in 1811, laborers were cutting the roadbed westward from the Potomac River at Cumberland, Maryland. The National Road was to be the last road funded by the federal government for several years. States and cities started laying down thousands of miles of roads that included toll charges. You guys might not see that very often. There's a few toll roads in California, but back east there's quite a few, which means that in order to drive on a road, you actually have to get money out of your pocket and pay. So that doesn't happen down 215, I-15, or 95 very often, but in other states it happens quite a bit. Even after they have paid for the road, because they will say, well, we need to charge a toll to pay for something, they still continue to pay for it. They still continue to charge for people to ride on it. and then they'll say it's for maintenance. So, steamboats and canals. Rivers offered a much faster way to transport goods. This is a unique style of transportation. Steamboats started being constructed to transport the goods. The breakthrough came when Robert Fulton, who developed the first commercially successful steamboat, and Robert Livingston took the Claremont 150 miles up the Hudson River to Albany in only 32 hours. By 1850, over 700 steamboats, called riverboats, traveled along the nation's waterways. Due to the growth of river travel, many canals started being built throughout the country. By 1840, more than 3,300 miles of canals snaked through the nation, creating new economic growth. And then what was the Iron Horse? You can see it to the right. Peter Cooper built an American version of the British steam engine. In the 1800s, train systems started popping up throughout the country. This movement became very popular. The main reasons were due to the fact that trains could transport people and goods much faster than a stagecoach. Trains could also travel virtually anywhere a track was laid, and eventually would start to settle west. So it could transport goods faster, but not only that, it could transfer large amounts of good, and including, you could put cattle or horses or anything on that train for it to be hauled. And you can imagine how this changes the face of the United States when we're able to do that. So like I said, transportation allows us as a country to be connected for economic reasons and for defense. So we can move things from one area to the next, guns and men to fight, when these areas are connected well. So along with early industry comes some good and some bad things. So you can see industrialization sweeps the north. And just in case you don't know what industrialization is, it's the process in which a society or country or world transforms itself from a primarily agricultural society where you grow stuff into one based on manufacturing of goods and services. Industrialization took off in the 1800s. Beginning in the 1830s, many states encouraged industrialization by passing general incorporation laws. Industrialization started in the Northeast, where many streams provided factories with water power. By 1840, scores of textile factories had been built in the Northeast. Industry soon applied factory techniques to the production of lumber, shoes, leather, wagons, and other products. Francis Lowell introduced mass production of cotton cloth to the United States. Technological advances, the nation's industrial growth was aided by technological advances. People like Eli Whitney explained the value of interchangeable parts. So you could create mass parts and then put together one product at the end rather than making one whole product. So using this process, machines turned out large quantities of identical pieces. Communication improved as well when Samuel F.B. Morse, see the Morse code to the right, began working on a telegraph that developed Morse code for sending messages. You can see it's a symbol of dots and dashes. Remember SOS, save our souls, ... dash, 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 ... That's how you would do in Morse code. Well, because of this, large cities start to grow. With growth of industry, the population rapidly shifted. Many jobs pulled people out of the country where they were working on farms and pulled them into the cities. By 1820, many city populations had doubled or even tripled. Now think of this. Cities were made out of wood because that was the main thing that they were building with. But wood can only go up so far because the very bottom floor cannot support too many floors above it because wood is not actually that strong. So they had to spread out a little bit, but then they didn't have transportation to get those people into the cities to where those jobs were. So then eventually we're going to have iron and steel that will be created so that those buildings can be built on top of each other and then increase the population within those cities. And they don't have to, and then eventually they also have, rail systems just within a city, like a metro or a subway. And what it does is it brings people from further out into the city to work. So you can see how these populations change the face of a city back then. Well, because conditions were terrible, you can see the children working there to the right. People began to organize. People that worked in factories in the 1800s had a hard life of long hours and terrible working conditions. Many children were forced to work. Their small size was often an advantage to certain industries. In coal mining, children fit into smaller holes. Labor unions were groups of workers that joined together to improve their situations. If groups of workers joined together, they had more power. But Believe it or not, the family farm was the country's leading economic activity. It employed more people and produced more wealth than any other work during this particular time period. So, early industry, as you can see, and these two are graphs that will you'll be asked questions. And I wish I could draw on here, but it says, as you can see in the graph above, the rural population country grew by more than 20 million. People from 1810 to 1870. How do you know this? In 1810, it is about 6 million. But by 1870, the population is 29 million. Subtract 6 from 29 and see the growth rate. Using this equation, how much did the urban city population grow by? And then you can see I defined patent for you because the U.S. patents are issued. It is a set of exclusive rights granted by a sovereign state to an inventor or the assignee for a limited period of time in exchange for the public disclosure of the invention. An invention is a solution to a specific technological problem and may be a product or a process. Patents are a form of intellectual property. And you can see that we were issuing quite a few patents because people were inventing things to solve problems during this time. Some people say that because they had a little bit more free time, because food production improved, people didn't have to just concentrate on food, so they were able to have a little extra time to think. How can I improve my life? What can I do to make people's lives better? What can I do to make some more money? We're on section 3, and this is the land of cotton. So in the land of cotton, society in the South, in Southern society, the planters were at the tops of social classes. These people had 20 or more enslaved people. The next class was the yeoman farmers. This group of farmers was like the middle class and made up the vast majority of the white population. This group of people may have had 4 or fewer enslaved persons, but most had none at all. Near the bottom of society was the rural poor. These people usually lived on land too barren for successful farming. At the bottom of society were African Americans who were used primarily as slaves. In 1850, nearly 3.5 million African Americans lived in the South, making up 37% population. Now think about this. The original slaves that were shipped to the United States, there was only 500,000. Remember, if you look back, that was the least amount of slaves sent in the entire area of the New World. But now we're up to a population of 3.5 million just about 200 years later. And it actually makes up 37% of the population. African Americans' legal status, aside from ensuring a lifetime of bondage, enslaved persons had few legal rights. Slave codes forbade enslaved men and women from owning property or leaving slaveholders' premises without permission. And typically any marriages or children were not recognized and families were separated. Free African Americans. Not all African Americans were enslaved in 1850. Some 225,000 free African Americans resided in the South. Some of these slaves even resided in the northern part of the southern states, mainly Virginia and Maryland. Another 196,000 free African Americans lived in the North, where slavery was outlawed. However, they were not embraced there. Now, one of the things that increased slavery, yes, increased it, and this is a question that you will have to fill out in your questions, is this invention right here. It's an amazing picture of a cotton gin, which is an engine, okay? So you've probably heard of this before. You know, Eli Whitney invented it, and he was probably just going, man, I really want to invent something that will make this process easier. A machine that quickly separates cotton fibers from their seeds, allowing for much greater productivity than manual separation. I've tried to separate the seeds from cotton. It is actually quite difficult. So he invents this, and what it actually does is it increases slavery. Why? How? Well, it increases slavery because once they were able to make more money off of cotton faster, they needed more cotton grown and picked. And who does that? The slaves do that. So when this could do the separation process faster, now they need more cotton to separate, and then they could turn it into cloth, or they can sell it raw, and then they're going to make even more money. So he could not have foreseen the ways in which this invention would change society for the worse. The most significant of these was the growth of slavery. While it was true that the cotton gin reduced the labor from removing seeds, it did not reduce the need for slaves to grow and pick the cotton. In fact, the opposite occurred. Cotton growing became so profitable that for the planters that it greatly increased their demand for both land and slave labor. In 1790, there were 6 slave states. By 1860, there were 15. From 1790 Until Congress banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808, Southerners imported 80,000 Africans. By 1860, approximately 1 in 3 Southerners was a slave. And that goes back to that 37% that I just told you about on the last slide. Now, due to some of these, due to this and the slavery and the 37%, we have 2 individuals here that rose to fame through their experiences, Nat Turner and Solomon Northup. And these are 2 very different individuals. You can see that there's actually going to be a movie about Solomon Northup's life. There's an old movie that I used to show my class when I was at Bonanza, and it's fascinating. I think Geordie from Deep Space Nine or one of those shows played him. But anyway, Nat Turner was an African-American slave who led a slave rebellion in Virginia on August 21st, 1831. That resulted in 51 white deaths. Whites responded with at least 100 black deaths. He gathered supporters in Southampton County, Virginia. Turner was convicted, sentenced to death, and hanged. In the aftermath, the state executed 56 blacks of being a part of Nat Turner's slave rebellion. 200 blacks were also killed after being beaten by white militias and mobs reacting to the violence. Across Virginia and other southern states, state legislators passed new laws prohibiting education of slaves and free blacks, restricting rights of assemblies and other civil rights for free blacks, and requiring white ministers to be present at black worship services. Slavery and vicious hate crimes continued, possibly because of President Andrew Jackson's vocal advocacy against abolition. Solomon Northup, however, was born a free African American. He was from Saratoga Springs, New York, was never a slave. He is noted for having been kidnapped in 1841 when enticed with a job offer. When he was accompanied his supposed employers to Washington, D.C., they drugged him and sold him into slavery in Louisiana. So you can only imagine how scary this is, because you're all free. If you were sold into slavery, how would you ever think about that being your life? After 12 years of bondage, he regained his freedom in January 1853. He was one of very few to do so in such cases. Held in the Red River region of Louisiana by several different owners, he got news to his family, who contacted friends and enlisted the New York governor in his cause. New York State had passed a law in 1840 to recover African-American residents who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. You guys can go ahead and watch the trailer for that show, actually. Brad Pitt's in it. So the final section is growing sectionalism. And what is sectionalism? It is basically the separation idea. You're from the North, you're from the South, you're from the West. We still talk about this a lot. So one of those things, of course, comes with that is the Missouri Compromise. It prohibited slavery in the former Louisiana Territory, north of the 36th parallel, essentially, except within the boundaries of the proposed state of Missouri. So everything other than Missouri was going to be non-slave in the Louisiana Territory if it was north of that area. Okay, north of that area, you see the picture. The major issue faced when Missouri was applying for statehood was the fact that the country was debating whether slave states should expand westward. With the nation standing at 11 free states and 11 slave states, the entrance of a new state would upset the balance in the Senate and in political power. To solve this problem, Maine, which had always been a part of Massachusetts, applied for statehood. When that happened, Maine was brought into the Union as a free state, following Missouri joining as a slave state. Now, one of the things that was interesting in your chapter is this election of 1824. You can see the definition of sectionalism up there. So here are the 4 players, all of which were Republican, and you can see what their beliefs were in green. And you can see that there are kind of the way these people are divided up, where they're from, the states that they came from, and you can see their pictures. They all look a little crazy, don't they? I guess that's because photography was very different back then. So anyway, what's the result of this? It's just amazing. Jackson had the most popular vote, but no candidates won the majority in the Electoral College. So what would you do at that point? Well, according to the Constitution, the vote goes to Congress. Well, Clay was eliminated with the least votes, but Clay was the Speaker of the House. So here he is, the Speaker of the House, the head of that particular group, and he gets to say, you know what? I'm going to throw my power, or I'm going to throw whatever I like, and I'm going to put it behind. And who did he choose? John Quincy Adams. And so because he did that, Then, and because he hated Jackson, he gave his support to Adams, who won 13 votes. So a presidential election was decided on those 13 votes in Congress, not on the popular vote and not on the Electoral College. Can you imagine that? So then when we come to the election of 1828, it was between Jackson and Adams again, but this time Jackson won both the popular and electoral votes. So I hope you guys enjoyed Chapter 7.